Most people believe the truth sets you free. That belief is comforting. It sounds noble. It sounds hopeful, but it's incomplete because no one talks about what happens before freedom. No one talks about the isolation, the doubt, the quiet fear that creeps. And when you realize something most people around you already know, yet refuse to acknowledge. This story is not about a hero. It's not about a revolutionary. It's about an ordinary man who noticed something he was never supposed to notice. And once he did, there was no going back. He lived a normal life. Not good, not terrible, just acceptable. Wake up, work, conversations that sounded meaningful but meant nothing. Evenings spent distracting himself from thoughts he didn't want to hear. He believed the rules were real. Work hard and you'll be rewarded. Stay quiet and you'll be safe. Follow the path and life will make sense. And for a long time it did, or at least it appeared to. Until one evening changed everything. It wasn't dramatic, no accident, no tragedy, no moment that looked important from the outside. Just a conversation he overheard by accident. Two people speaking casually, comfortably, as if nothing they were saying mattered. One of them laughed and said, "Everyone knows the truth, but no one says anything." That was it. No explanation, no context, just that sentence. He smiled at first. People say meaningless things all the time, but the sentence followed him. It stayed with him longer than it should have. On the walk home, in the silence of his room, in the pause between thoughts before sleep. It wasn't loud. It was persistent. The next morning, something felt off. Not in the world, in him. He looked at people differently. At work, he noticed how conversations worked. People didn't say what they believed. They said what was safe. They nodded at ideas they didn't agree with. They laughed at jokes they didn't find funny. They praised systems they quietly complained about later. No one questioned anything openly. Not because they didn't see problems, but because questioning had consequences. And everyone knew it. That's when the sentence returned, "Everyone knows." But no one says anything. He tested it. Carefully, with someone he trusted. Not directly, not aggressively, just a gentle question. "Do you ever feel like something is wrong?" The reaction was immediate. A pause. A look around. A forced smile. And then a whisper. "You think too much. Don't do that. It never ends well." The conversation shifted instantly. As if nothing had happened. As if the question had never been asked. But something inside him shifted permanently. That night he couldn't sleep. Because once you notice silence, you start seeing it everywhere. In the news, in relationships, in success stories that felt rehearsed, in advice that sounded wise but kept people exactly where they were. The world wasn't chaotic. It was organized, and silence was the glue holding it together. He realized something terrifying. The truth wasn't hidden. It was shared quietly, passed in looks, in pauses, in jokes that weren't really jokes. People knew. They just didn't speak. Because speaking had a price, and silence was cheaper. He began to understand the real hierarchy of the world. It wasn't built on intelligence, or morality, or honesty. It was built on comfort. Those who protected comfort were rewarded. Those who threatened it were removed. Not violently, politely, ignored, replaced, labeled difficult. That's how the system stayed clean. For the first time, he asked himself a dangerous question. If everyone knows, and no one speaks, what happens to someone who does? The answer frightened him. Because he already knew it. People like to believe silence is harmless. It's not. Silence is an agreement. Every time you choose not to speak, you vote for the way things are. And once he understood that, the world felt heavier. Because ignorance had been taken away. He didn't want to be special. He didn't want to be brave. He wanted to go back to not seeing. But the mind doesn't unlearn awareness. Once the door opens, it doesn't close gently. It slams. That was the first crack. The moment his comfortable life began to fracture. Not because he rebelled, but because he noticed. And noticing is the beginning of every collapse. That night, sitting alone in the dark, he understood the first real truth of his life. The most powerful prison in the world is not built with walls. It's built with silence. And the most dangerous thing a person can do is start listening to it. Knowing the truth doesn't change the world immediately. It changes you first. And that is the most dangerous phase. Because the world still expects you to behave like the person you used to be. After that night, he tried to return to normal. He followed the same routine, wore the same clothes, used the same polite expressions, but something was missing. Or rather, something extra had been added. A constant awareness, like a low, invisible sound that never stopped. At work, meetings felt theatrical. People spoke confidently about ideas they didn't believe in. They praised systems that exhausted them. They pretended outcomes were accidental, not designed. He noticed how often truth was replaced with acceptable language. Failures were called learning experiences. Control was called structure. Fear was called professionalism. Everyone knew the translation. No one acknowledged it. He started observing faces instead of words. A slight tightening of the jaw, a pause before agreeing, eyes that avoided contact when certain topics appeared. These weren't coincidences. They were signals, a shared unspoken understanding. One afternoon, during a casual conversation, someone joked, "If you want peace, don't ask questions." Everyone laughed, including him. But this time, the laughter felt wrong, like participating in his own betrayal. The more he noticed, the lonelier he became. Not physically. Socially, nothing had changed. But internally, he was separating. He could no longer fully join conversations, because he knew what was being avoided. And once you know what's missing, everything sounds incomplete. He tried to talk about it again, this time more carefully, with someone older, someone experienced, someone who had made it. He didn't mention truth. He mentioned exhaustion. How do you stay motivated when things don't really change? The response was calm. Practiced. You stop expecting change. You learn how to survive within it. There was no bitterness, no anger, just acceptance, and that terrified him more than rebellion ever could. That's when he understood. People didn't stay silent because they were unaware. They stayed silent because they had adapted. Adaptation wasn't strength. It was surrender disguised as wisdom. He began to see two versions of every person, who they were privately and who they performed publicly. The distance between those versions measured their fear. Some had a small gap. Others, enormous, but everyone had one. At night, his thoughts became heavier. He replayed conversations. Not what was said, but what wasn't. He realized how early silence had been taught. As children, don't say that. Be careful. That's not appropriate. As adults, that's unrealistic. That's risky. That's not how things work. Different words. Same lesson. One question haunted him. Was silence chosen or inherited? He looked at history. Not the heroic version, the quiet version. The moments when change could have happened, but didn't. Not because of villains, but because of comfortable people, people who knew better and waited for someone else to speak first. The truth became clear. The system didn't need force. It needed patience, and silence was patient. He noticed something else, too. Those who spoke too honestly were described using specific words. Unstable, obsessed, negative, difficult, never wrong, just inconvenient. Truth wasn't defeated. It was discredited. One evening, scrolling through messages, he saw a post. Someone had said something honest, direct, uncomfortable. The reactions were immediate. Not discussion, mockery, dismissal, silence from those who privately agreed. He felt a familiar tightening in his chest. Fear, not of disagreement, of isolation. That night, he asked himself the question he had been avoiding. What am I willing to lose for the truth? The answer didn't come quickly, because the list of potential losses was long. Reputation, opportunities, belonging, safety. And what did truth offer in return? No guarantees, only clarity. Clarity is expensive. It doesn't pay immediately. It doesn't protect you. It simply removes illusions, and illusions are what most people live on. He noticed how silence rewarded obedience. Those who never questioned rose smoothly. They weren't smarter. They were safer. They understood the rules. Don't disrupt comfort. Don't name contradictions. Don't say what everyone thinks. And life will remain manageable. The realization hit him hard. The world wasn't broken. It was functioning exactly as designed. A design that favored quiet compliance over noisy honesty. He felt anger. Not explosive, slow, heavy. The kind that sinks into your bones, because anger without an outlet turns inward. It asks, if you see this, and still say nothing, what does that make you? He tried distraction, entertainment, noise, endless scrolling. But the truth followed him, because truth doesn't shout. It waits. One night he dreamed he was in a room full of people, Everyone's mouth was open, but no sound came out. They looked at him, expecting something. When he tried to speak, his voice echoed loudly, too loudly. Everyone turned away. The room emptied. He woke up sweating, heart racing, understanding exactly what the dream meant. Silence protects groups, but it isolates individuals. And once you stop sharing the silence, you become a threat. He began to understand why people chose silence, not because they were weak, but because they were tired. Tired of fighting invisible battles, tired of being misunderstood, tired of paying a price no one acknowledges. Silence was rest, but it came at a cost, a slow erosion of self. He stood at a crossroads, not a dramatic one, no speeches, no announcements, just a quiet decision. Remain silent and stay safe, or speak and become alone. The world likes to say, be yourself. But what it means is, be yourself as long as it doesn't disrupt us. The moment you cross that invisible line, support disappears. He realized something even darker. Silence doesn't just protect systems, it protects lies. Lies survive not because people believe them, but because people repeat them out of habit. He noticed how often he corrected himself mid-sentence. Softened words, removed edges, adjusted tone. He was already participating, already learning how to stay invisible, and that scared him more than open punishment. One evening alone, he whispered the truth out loud, just to hear it. The room felt heavier, as if the walls were listening. He laughed at himself, but the feeling didn't go away. The truth wasn't dangerous because it was false. It was dangerous because it was accurate, and accuracy threatens comfort. He understood the second truth of his awakening. Knowing the truth doesn't make you free, it makes you responsible. Responsible for what you tolerate. Responsible for what you repeat. Responsible for what you allow to continue. And responsibility is heavier than ignorance. Ignorance sleeps well. Responsibility does not. That night, he made a small decision. Not to speak publicly. Not yet, but to stop lying to himself. No more pretending he didn't see. No more comforting illusions. It was the first step. And it felt like standing on the edge of something irreversible. Because once you stop lying internally, external silence becomes unbearable. He didn't know it yet. But this decision would cost him more than comfort. It would cost him relationships. It would cost him safety. And eventually, it would force him to choose between truth and survival. And that choice was coming sooner than he expected. A decision not to act, a way to avoid conflict. But he was wrong. Silence isn't empty. It's active. It watches. It remembers. And eventually, it demands loyalty. He noticed it in small ways. A comment he didn't make. A disagreement he swallowed. A thought he edited before it reached his lips. Each time, silence rewarded him. No tension. No awkwardness. No risk. But the rewards began to feel like chains. The shift happened slowly. So slowly he almost missed it. One day, someone at work said something untrue. Not a mistake, a convenient distortion. Everyone heard it. Everyone knew. No one corrected it. He felt the familiar pressure in his chest. This time, he didn't even consider speaking. He stayed quiet automatically. And that scared him more than fear ever had, because silence had stopped being a choice. It had become a reflex. Later that day, someone pulled him aside. Friendly tone. Casual smile. "You handled that well," they said. He didn't understand. Handled what? They leaned closer, knowing when not to speak. That's important. It sounded like advice. It felt like a warning. That night, the realization hit him hard. Silence doesn't just punish those who speak. It rewards those who don't, and rewards are more effective than threats. He began to see how silence identified its allies. Those who never disrupted the flow. Those who nodded at the right moments. Those who learned when to look away. They advanced quietly. Not because they were exceptional, but because they were predictable. Predictability is safety, and safety is currency. He noticed how language changed around him. Truth became tone-deaf. Honesty became unprofessional. Questions became negativity. Words were weapons, but only when used carefully. One evening, he met someone who reminded him of his old self. Curious, restless, uncomfortable with easy answers. They asked too many questions. He saw it immediately. And something unexpected happened. He felt afraid, not for himself. For them, he found himself saying something he never thought he would. Be careful. The words left his mouth automatically. The moment they did, he froze. He had become the warning, the very thing that once frustrated him. That night, guilt kept him awake. Not because he lied, but because he participated. Silence doesn't just spread through fear. It spreads through protection. People don't warn you to control you. They warn you because they remember the cost. The next day, something subtle changed. People started treating him differently. More included, more trusted, more inside. He was being rewarded for alignment. And the rewards felt good. That was the most dangerous part. Comfort dulls resistance, and silence loves comfort. He noticed how often people tested each other. Not with questions, with reactions. A joke, a comment, a hint of truth. They watched closely. Who laughed? Who flinched? Who stayed neutral? That's how silence measured loyalty. He realized the system didn't need surveillance. People monitored each other, and silence was the shared language. One afternoon he slipped, just slightly, a comment that leaned too close to honesty. The room shifted. Not dramatically, just enough. A pause. A look exchanged. Someone clearing their throat. The conversation moved on. But something had been noted. Later, the same friendly person approached him again, still smiling. "Everything okay lately?" they asked. Concerned tone, concerned eyes. He nodded. They nodded back. Nothing more was said. Everything was understood. That's when he felt it. Silence wasn't just protection. It was control. He became hyper-aware of himself. How he spoke. How he reacted. How much truth he allowed to surface. Not because anyone forced him, but because the boundaries were clear. Cross them and you'd feel it. The pressure wasn't loud. It was constant. Like gravity. He started noticing who disappeared. Not physically. Socially. People who spoke too freely slowly faded. Invitations stopped. Opportunities dried up. Their names were mentioned less and less. No drama. No confrontation. Just quiet removal. That's how silence keeps its hands clean. He remembered the sentence that started everything. Everyone knows the truth, but no one says anything. Now he understood the second part. Because saying something isn't punished immediately, it's punished gradually. He began to feel trapped. Not by rules, by expectations. The expectation that he would continue playing his role. The expectation that he would protect the silence. One night he asked himself a brutal question. At what point did silence stop being something I fear and start being something I defend? The answer hurt. Because he knew it was already happening. He thought about leaving, changing environments, starting over. But silence isn't tied to places. It travels with people, and people carry it everywhere. He realized something deeply unsettling. Silence doesn't need everyone. It only needs enough people, enough to isolate the rest. The more he complied, the safer he felt. And the safer he felt, the quieter he became. It was a perfect loop. One evening, alone again, he spoke out loud. "I see it." The word sounded foreign, almost rebellious. The room felt tense, as if he'd broken a rule no one had written down. He understood the third truth. Silence doesn't just hide the truth, it trains you to betray it. And betrayal, once normalized, doesn't feel like betrayal anymore. It feels like maturity. He stood at another crossroads. This one darker than the last, because now the cost of speaking was clearer, and the benefits of silence were tangible. He could continue. Stay safe, stay included, stay quiet. Or he could do the one thing silence could not tolerate. He could break pattern, not by shouting, not by exposing everything, but by refusing to protect the lie. He didn't know yet how he would do it. Only that once silence turns against you, remaining silent becomes unbearable, because the final stage of silence is not quiet. It's self-erasure, and he was dangerously close to disappearing. There is a moment before every irreversible decision, a quiet pause, a breath where the mind understands that whatever happens next cannot be undone. He lived in that pause for weeks. On the outside, nothing had changed. He still showed up, still nodded, still smiled at the right moments. But internally, something was decaying. Silence had stopped feeling like protection. It felt like corrosion. He noticed it in his thoughts. They were shorter now, less curious, more cautious. Truth used to expand his mind. Now it suffocated it. And that's when he realized the final trick of silence. It doesn't just control behavior. It reshapes identity. One morning, he looked in the mirror longer than usual. not searching for flaws, searching for himself. And for the first time, he couldn't tell which parts of him were real and which parts were adaptations. That terrified him. The breaking point didn't arrive dramatically. No crisis. No explosion. Just fatigue. The kind that comes from holding your breath too long. It happened during a meeting. A familiar setting. Familiar faces. A familiar lie was repeated. Clean. Efficient. Unchallenged. He felt the reflex kick in. Stay quiet. Stay safe. But something inside him resisted. Not anger. Not courage. Clarity. He didn't plan to speak. There was no script. The words came out because they had nowhere else to go. I don't think that's true. That was all. No accusation. No emotion. Just a sentence. The room didn't react immediately. Silence stretched. Not the comfortable kind, the alert kind. Eyes shifted. Someone cleared their throat. The lie hovered in the air, exposed. He felt it instantly. The invisible line had been crossed. Someone laughed nervously. Another person tried to reframe it. Well, it depends how you look at it. The conversation moved on. But nothing moved on. He could feel it. A recalibration. He had been reclassified. After the meeting, no one confronted him. That's not how silence works. Instead, things became subtle. Too subtle to argue with. Replies to his messages came slower. Conversations stopped when he entered rooms. People became polite in a distant way. Professional. Careful. Silence doesn't attack. It withdraws. And withdrawal is devastating, because it leaves no enemy to fight. He tried to tell himself he was imagining it. That paranoia was just fear, but patterns don't lie. A week later, he was excluded from a decision he should have been part of. It slipped our mind, someone said, smiling. Apologetic, unconvincing. That night, the fear finally arrived. Not panic, not dread, a cold understanding. This was the price. He replayed the moment he spoke. The tone, the timing, the simplicity, and he understood something crucial. It wasn't what he said. It was the fact that he said anything at all. Silence doesn't fear loud rebels. It fears calm honesty. Because calm honesty can't be dismissed as chaos. He noticed how people avoided being alone with him now, as if proximity was contagious, as if truth might spread. The irony was unbearable. Everyone still believed the same things. Nothing had changed. Except him. Except his willingness to protect the lie. He felt anger again. But this time it was focused. Not at others. At the system that trained people to punish integrity while calling it professionalism. One evening, someone finally spoke to him. Not openly. Not directly. They sat beside him and said quietly, "You shouldn't have said that." There was no hostility, only concern. "You put a target on yourself," they continued. "You know how this works." He nodded. He did know. That was the problem. "Why did you do it?" they asked. He thought for a moment, then answered honestly, "Because staying quiet was starting to feel like lying." They didn't respond. They didn't need to. From that moment on, the isolation became real, not dramatic, but consistent. He lost access to information, then influence, then relevance, not officially, organically. Silence didn't scream. "You are wrong," it whispered. "You are alone." At first, loneliness hurt deeply. Humans are wired for belonging, and silence weaponizes that wiring. But something unexpected happened. As the noise faded, clarity increased. Without constant performance, he could think again. He realized how much energy silence had demanded. Monitoring tone, editing thoughts, predicting reactions. Now that he had crossed the line, there was nothing left to protect. Freedom didn't arrive as happiness. It arrived as relief. The relief of not pretending. He began speaking carefully but truthfully. Not to provoke, not to convert, simply to remain aligned with himself. The reactions were predictable. Some distanced themselves further. Others watched silently. A few looked relieved. That's when he saw it clearly. Silence survives because people believe they are alone in seeing the truth. The moment someone speaks, that illusion cracks. He received a message late one night from someone he barely knew. "I heard what you said. Thank you for saying it." Nothing more. No follow-up. But it mattered. He wasn't alone. He never had been. Silence had just made it feel that way. The cost of speaking was real. He paid it daily. But the cost of staying silent would have been worse. Total self-erasure. He understood the fourth truth. Speaking once doesn't change the world, but it changes the terms of your existence. You stop negotiating with yourself. You stop asking permission to think. You stop shrinking to fit comfort. The system adjusted. It always does. But so did he. He didn't become a hero. He didn't inspire a movement. That wasn't the point. The point was this. Silence lost its hold on him. The moment he stopped protecting it. And once silence loses its grip, it reveals its final weakness. It cannot survive when enough people speak, without fear and without performance. He didn't know what would happen next. But he knew one thing for certain. He would never go back. Silence doesn't collapse loudly. It dissolves, slowly, almost politely. After he spoke, nothing dramatic happened. No confrontation, no public backlash, no sudden downfall. And that's what made it dangerous. The world continued. People laughed. Meetings happened. Decisions were made. But he had moved to the edge of the frame, still present, no longer central. At first he waited, for retaliation, for punishment. But silence doesn't punish aggressively. It waits. It allows you to feel expendable. He began to understand the final phase of silence. It doesn't need to destroy you. It only needs to convince you that you don't matter. Opportunities stopped arriving, not denied, just absent. His name was no longer suggested. His opinions no longer requested. He had become optional. There is a specific kind of pain that comes from being ignored after being seen. It's quieter than rejection, but far more corrosive. He spent long evenings alone, not because he had no one, but because he was no longer invited into spaces where truth was inconvenient. And yet, something inside him felt strangely stable. The anxiety he used to carry had faded. The constant self-monitoring was gone. He no longer rehearsed sentences in his head. He no longer wondered if he was allowed to think what he thought. That was the trade. Belonging for integrity. Noise for clarity. He began to notice others more clearly. People who had stayed silent for years. People who looked tired in a way sleep couldn't fix. They weren't unhappy. They were dimmed. One afternoon, someone sat next to him. No preface. No warning. I wish I had said what you said. They didn't wait for a response. They stood up and left. That sentence stayed with him, because it confirmed what silence works so hard to hide. People are not quiet because they don't see. They are quiet because they don't feel safe. He realized something profound. Silence isn't maintained by fear alone. It's maintained by the belief that speaking changes nothing, but silence itself changes everything. It slowly turns people into observers of their own lives. He began writing, not publicly, not to persuade, just to document what he saw, what he felt, what was left unsaid. Truth needs witnesses, even when it has no audience. He noticed how easily people justified their silence. It's not the right time. It's not my place. Someone else will speak. Those sentences sounded responsible. They weren't. They were delays. History isn't shaped by the loud. It's shaped by the moment. The quiet stopped protecting lies. He no longer tried to convince anyone. That was another trick of silence, turning truth into a performance. He didn't perform. He simply existed honestly. And something unexpected happened. Slowly, quietly, others began doing the same. Not publicly, not dramatically. In private conversations, in careful choices, in moments of refusal, silence didn't vanish. It weakened. Because silence feeds on unanimity, and unanimity had been broken. He understood the final truth. Silence doesn't end when someone speaks. It ends when people stop participating in it. The world would not change overnight. It never does. But something more important had changed. He could look at himself without flinching. He could sit in quiet without fear. He could hear uncomfortable thoughts without rushing to silence them. The cost had been real, but the reward was something silence could never offer. Alignment. He thought back to the sentence that had started everything. Everyone knows the truth, but no one says anything. Now he understood the missing ending. Until someone does. And when someone does, silence doesn't shatter. It fades. The most powerful lies aren't destroyed by arguments. They're destroyed when people stop pretending. This story isn't a warning. It's a mirror. If you've ever noticed something you weren't supposed to notice, if you've ever felt that quiet pressure to stay comfortable instead of honest, if you've ever stayed silent to protect a system that never protected you. You already know the truth. The question is not whether you see it. The question is, how long will you protect the silence? Because silence doesn't ask forever. It only waits until you forget who you were, before you learn to be quiet. And that is the real cost.